welcome to Brain Chat. I'm Dr. Mitzi Joy Williams, your board-certified neurologist and MS specialist, and my mission is to engage, educate, and empower those affected by MS to become an active part of their healthcare team. Here on Brain Chat, we'll be discussing all things MS, health and wellness, advocacy, and we'll even throw a little bit of music and music therapy in there as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Brain Chat with the Nerdy Neurologist. I am Dr. Mitzi, the Nerdy Neurologist, and I'm so excited to be here with you all tonight to talk about a topic that I think is really important. Sometimes when we talk about MS advocacy, we can get very focused on our local areas, which is important to know how to advocate for yourself in your local area. But I want to take Brain Chat global tonight. So I'm going to talk to some amazing advocates who are primarily based in the UK, from the UK. And we'll talk about some of the issues that may be a little bit different for those advocating for themselves across the pond, as well as some of those that are very similar. So I've got some amazing folks with me tonight, and I cannot wait to have this conversation. Brain Chat would like to thank its sponsor, the National MS Society, for supporting us. And also thank you to all of you for taking your time out to watch tonight's episode. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to introduce my amazing guests. All right. So we'll start with Trishna Baradia, who is a multi-award winning patient advocate. She was diagnosed with MS in 2008, and she'll share a little bit about her story with us. She works both nationally and internationally to raise awareness, improve information and services, and to ensure that the patient voice is being heard throughout the healthcare journey, as well as in the life sciences industry, not just for people with MS, but for a variety of conditions. She has many different roles. I have the pleasure of working with her as a member of the MS in the 21st Century Committee Steering Group. She also works with the MS Society in the UK. She sits on the governance board for the MS Centers of Excellence with the UK MS Society, and she sits on the editorial board of Neurology and Therapy Journal. She also participated in the UK edition of Dancing with the Stars, and I can't wait to hear a little bit more about that. Thank you so much, Trishna, for coming to hang out with us on Brain Chat.
Hi, Mitzi. No, it's a pleasure.
Absolutely. And our next guest is Rachel Horn. She's a journalist, researcher, and MS advocate, was diagnosed in 2009. She has written extensively on MS and other issues for numerous prestigious peer-reviewed journals, and regularly talks with the BBC's Radio 4 about her MS experience. She is a strong advocate for equality and diversity, and recently set up the annual Rachel Horn Prize for Women's Research in MS. She's also an honorary research fellow at the Wolfson Institute of Population Health, Queen Mary University, London. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. So listen, we are going to have a good conversation. I am so excited because you ladies are talking about all the things and doing all the things that really get me excited: advocacy and research. Okay. So, and diversity and equity and inclusion. So listen, we've got a lot of things to touch on tonight. But first, introduce yourselves to the Brain Chat audience. Tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your journey with MS. And we'll start with you, Trishna.
So my journey with MS started in 2004-ish. I lost the strength in both my hands, but like many people who are eventually diagnosed with MS, it was put down to something completely different. MS didn't even come into the equation. It wasn't until it was summer 2007, I completely lost the feeling down one side of my body. Wow. And that's what put me onto a path of an MS diagnosis. So I had various other symptoms as well, mostly sensory. So pins and needles, I had Lemieux sign, pain, fatigue. And eventually I was given the diagnosis of relapsing MS in May 2008. So I've been diagnosed now for 15 years. And it was really the diagnosis and that whole experience that got me into advocacy, because I was essentially given this life-changing diagnosis, and I was just sent away with no information, no support, no signposting even as to where to go, didn't know what support and services were available, didn't know what information to trust, where to get information. And that really, I think it really defined the start of that whole part of my life of living with MS, because I very much see my life as, pre-MS diagnosis and post-MS diagnosis. And I thought, other people shouldn't have to go through this. I shouldn't have had to go through that kind of experience. So what can I do to make things better? And that's what got me into the advocacy space in the first place. And from there, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about it, it kind of snowballed. And I went into various different directions to what I'm doing today, which is I advocate for lots of different conditions, lots of different disease areas, and I also work in patient engagement as a consultant as well.
I love it. I love it. I love it. All right, Rachel, tell us a little bit about, your diagnosis journey and how you got into the advocacy space.
Sure. My experience was slightly different from Trishna's, even though it was around the same time. I was 43 years old. It was 2009 in the autumn. And I noticed a pins and needles in one hand, and I thought I was just writer's cramp or a back problem. Within a week, I was pretty much paralyzed down my right side. And, in hindsight, why I didn't get to, sort of go to an emergency room, an A&E, I don't know. But I did go to a GP, and he very quickly fast-tracked me. So within 10 days, I was at Queen Square Hospital in London and was given the diagnosis that I had MS. So mine, I think, was a bit different from yours, Trishna. Where you often speak to people with MS and they say they get the diagnosis and they look back and they think, there were several sort of aha moments that they sort of pushed aside, whereas mine was a severe attack. So it did come as an awful shock. And like Trishna, once I was sent home from the hospital after a couple of days, it was pretty much, go on, just lead your life and get on with it. And I think also back then, the internet in 2009 was a bit more in its infancy. And I just remember spending hours on there trying to get any information. And it all looked pretty bleak, didn't it? It didn't, don't you think, Trishna, back then?
Yeah.
It was very much, and I was also slightly reluctant to go to any MS meetings because I'd heard stories of people in there with canes and walkers that were older and wheelchairs. And I just think this, I was 43. I was thinking this can't be happening to me. So I think the path also for advocacy, I think for quite a while, I kept my head down. I didn't even want to think that I had the disease. And then I got in touch with somebody who I think we're all familiar with, Professor Gavin Giovannoni at Barts, who found out that I was a journalist. So he sort of pulled me in and said, look, why don't you write about a meeting we're having? And that kind of snowballed. And I'll be absolutely honest with you, Trishna, at that time, you were very much my hero. And one of the reasons I did get into advocacy, because I kept on hearing your name everywhere. Awesome. And I think you were one of the few people that was a sort of symbol of MS, and you look different, and you talked, you were just much more, I think, optimistic, and I thought, God, I've really got to get into this, and see how we can help other people, diagnosed and help them out to sort of find their way.
Awesome. I mean, that is amazing. And I didn't know that. That's so amazing. But I mean, Trishna is such a light, and so a couple of themes I've heard here, in Trishna's case, it took you a little bit of a while to get diagnosed. Rachel, you had a very severe attack in the beginning, were diagnosed very quickly. But still, even though you were diagnosed very quickly, kind of struggled with this idea of, advocacy. I just don't want to talk about it, and I think there are just so many different journeys in people with MS that it's important for everybody to see the different breadth of, people in terms of their functioning, There's some people who may not be walking very well, but their brains are doing great and they're working and doing all the stuff. And there's some people that may be walking very well, but may have other challenges. And so it's important for people to be able to see themselves in the MS community. I'm so grateful for both of you guys kind of being out there so people can see the amazing work that you're doing. So let's talk a little bit about in your bio, Trishna, it talks about incorporating the patient voice throughout the journey. So I'd like for both of you to touch a little bit on this. I always talk about how as a physician who treats MS, as I've gotten more into the advocacy space, it's been very humbling. And I've learned to do a lot more listening than talking because, I used to assume because I sat in front of people every day that I knew exactly what the patient community wanted, even though I'm not a person living with MS. But I've become much more humble and realized that I don't know everything. And I need to make sure that I'm listening to those who actually have that expertise. So let's talk about the importance of that patient voice throughout the journey.
Particularly in the UK, there's been a real shift over the past, I would say probably particularly around 20 years in terms of what we're seeing as it's known as the shared decision-making model. And I think we're moving away from that paternalistic kind of model of healthcare where a doctor knows best, you just listen to what the doctor says, follow instructions, don't ask any questions. And I think also with the internet, there's been what I call a democratization of information. So people are now have the ability to be much more informed about their health, about their conditions. So they are able to ask questions. They are able to take a more informed position in decisions that are being made about their healthcare. I think that's really important to remember because when we talk about putting the patient voice into healthcare, it's part of that shift. It's part of making sure that when people are diagnosed with something or are going through a diagnosis, they have the information available. They feel confident to be able to have conversations with their healthcare professionals, to be able to make those decisions together and have a two-way conversation. I also do a lot of work with industry. So that might be pharmaceutical companies, it might be contract research organizations that operationalize clinical trials, it might be scientific publishers. So getting the patient voice heard in scientific publications, because every single part of what I call the big complex healthcare ecosystem is all working towards the same thing. And that's essentially better outcomes for people who are being diagnosed or living with a health condition. And that's why the patient voice becomes so important, because you said yourself, Mitzi, that a lot of the time healthcare professionals, or it's maybe the pharmaceutical industry or whoever it is that's involved in healthcare, they think because they're doing things for patients, they somehow know what patients want, what patients think, what patients feel. Actually, the best people to be talking about that and to be providing insights about that are the patients and also the caregivers as well. We always need to remember the caregivers in this. We're the experts.
Right.
And that's why we need to better embed the patient voice throughout that so the healthcare. The term journey is can be a bit of a controversial one, but it's literally from the time when somebody starts experiencing symptoms all the way through to diagnosis and then living with and managing a condition. That's the person themselves is the best person to be able to say how they're thinking, how they're feeling, what their needs are, what do they want to get out of their life living with a certain condition. I mean, Rachel, I can see you nodding. I don't know if that's something which really resonates with you.
Absolutely. I was going to say sort of ditto, but I think you're right. And I think Trishna very much we've seen a shift, and I presume it's probably very similar in the US, where you're seeing it as a partnership. I also think, can we maybe throw into the mix that we've seen this huge surge in, in the last 25 years of MS medications that are available. And
Absolutely.
so suddenly you've got so many more choices. So we're no longer kept to, there's only one drug available and you're going to go on it. And so I think it is very much a choice, and that's working with a patient. Some will prefer something which isn't maybe as effective, but is a better safety profile. And there's some people that would prefer to take, say, much more of a risk and go on to a high efficacy. And also the questions, do you want an oral drug? Do you want an injectable? Do you want an infusion? So on one hand, no, it's no fun having MS, but at least we've got a lot of options. And I think that's something that, Trishna did bring up. We've got the internet, which in sometimes can be quite a dangerous place, but I think it does offer us a lot more information. So I think I've changed as a patient. I don't know if Trishna, you found this too, but rather than just going in and accepting and nodding my head, I'll say, well, hold on, I have read about this drug, and it's possible links to, say, breast cancer down the road, and being able to have a dialogue with the doctor rather than just seeing them in a white coat and thinking, God, doctor knows best. They're the expert.
And I also think in terms of the internationalization, just generally globalization, where as a like within the world, we're becoming closer. I've worked with advocates in countries where literally they're fighting for access to even a single drug.
Right.
But the reason why they're able to, and they have the information, is because now it's so much easier to be able to see what's going on in other parts of the world. They're able to talk to other advocates, talk to, to other health, other neurologists, for instance. So people like you, for example, Mitzi, you're on social media. People like Gavin Giovannoni, Aaron Boster, you're on social media and you're talking about things which enables people to be able to learn much more than that single healthcare professional that they're seeing in the clinic. So that in itself makes it much easier for people to also, like I said, have the confidence to go in and ask questions, because they're not only hearing a single line of thought. Back in the old days,
the Stone Ages.
It would be literally you and your consultant,
right?
And you wouldn't have the opportunity to be able to learn from other consultants, interact with other consultants, because the opportunity just wasn't there. Now we have that. So I think patients are now, they're not settling anymore. They are pushing and they are saying, well, I've seen this in this country, I've heard this, or seen this neurologist talking about this. I mean, it's happened with me as well. And one of the reasons why I moved my care from a general neurologist to an MS specialist, because I had the opportunity to be able to see what other healthcare professionals were talking about, their way of thinking, what they were proposing and things like that. And I think that's much easier these days, not just within your own country, but across nations, across borders now as well.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that. So I spend a lot of time with my colleagues on Brain Chat. We talk a lot about firing your doctor. If you're not getting what you need, go somewhere else. Right. And so, in some parts of the States, it is easy. I live in an area in Atlanta, Georgia, where there are multiple MS specialists. There are probably 10 different MS specialists in a very small area, but there are other parts of the country where maybe there aren't any. So how does that work, within your healthcare system? Trishna, you said you were able to switch, but, in places where it may not be as easy to just pick up and advance your care. How do you advocate for yourself to be able to do that if you feel like you're not getting what you need?
It is, I also have switched neurologists because I wasn't happy. And at first I did feel a sense of sort of guilt and think, oh gosh, and going through the process, and because in a way it does feel a bit personal. But I do think, and I think, Mitzi, UK are much smaller. There's only 130,000 people with MS in the UK, whereas in America, what is it, over 1 million, you suspect?
Yeah, close to 1 million.
That's right. And so you're saying within Atlanta, an urban area, you've got about 10 MS specialists. In London, where I'm from, yes, you do have that choice. But if you're in the middle of, say, mid Wales or rural Scotland, I think it is much more difficult to get, as I said, to move from what Trishna did, a general neurologist, to an MS specialist. And I also think, compared to other countries in Europe, I do know that UK doesn't have as many neurologists per capita per head than other countries. So I do think there is more of an acceptance where you can move around. You can you can try and find somebody that matches with you, because at the end of the day, it is your health, isn't it? And you've got to take care of yourself. And that was the one thing I did find with MS. I think suddenly, getting a life-changing decision or getting a chronic decision, it does sharpen you much more. Yeah.
I also think that, so I was going to say, I also think that it is becoming easier and will become easier as we've seen the rollout of telehealth. So people who would think twice about switching neurologists because they have to travel a far distance in order to see one, now might think, well, actually, I might have to just travel, say, once a year. But actually in between, I'll be able to have remote consultations. And I'm in that position where, so it's an 80 to 90 mile round trip to see my neurologist because he's not in my local area. But with the possibility of remote consultations, it has made things so much easier. I'm not spending an entire day for what could be, say, a 20-minute appointment just because obviously you're having to travel. And I think that will make things easier, and people will be thinking, well, actually I don't have to, for example, rely on somebody to take me. I would hope that in places, and I know that actually within the UK, so particularly some of the more remote areas of Scotland, telehealth has really made a difference to the care and the access to expertise that people are able to get. And I would hope that as we sort of move even further down the line and technology is rolled out and becomes even more embedded into the healthcare systems, that will make access to MS specialist neurologists much, much easier.
Yeah, I would agree. Same thing in the States. I think the biggest challenge is that, to practice in certain states, you have to have certain licenses. And so that has sometimes been a challenge, because I have people who maybe fly from other states to come and see me. And then we have to figure out how I'm going to see them in between. Or I have people that fly from other countries to come and see me, So I think figuring that piece out, there's still a couple of kinks to work out, but I think that is ultimately going to be an amazing solution for people who do not have access. But before we move on to the next topic, let's pause a little bit. And so let's talk about what tools are there available, maybe for that person who doesn't have the ability to switch, right? Their physician, maybe it's not just within their ability to travel far away. Maybe the telemedicine access isn't available, or maybe they're in one of those countries where they don't have as easy access. What would you recommend for those people who maybe can't move around but still want to advocate for themselves where they are?
So I think there's lots out there in terms of being able to learn about MS, gain information. So the Bart's MS blog, for instance, is a great research blog.
It is.
The being able to access information from other neurologists. So, for example, Mitzi, your social media channels, Aaron Boster, his YouTube videos are just so informative. And I think arming yourself with information, the various MS societies as well. Lots of not necessarily the national MS societies alone, but there's also various charities. So in the UK, for instance, we have the MS Society, we have the MS Trust, MS UK, Shift MS, we have the MS Therapy Centres. All of these can provide support, information, help people to sort of gain that confidence. And then there's other initiatives. I mean, Mitzi, at the top of the podcast, you mentioned MS in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go onto the MS in the 21st century website, there's various tools on there which you can download and you can use to start conversations or facilitate conversations with your neurologist. So I think it's about knowing where to look and where to go. And often people who are talking about these things are people like Rachel and myself and other advocates.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about these things on our channels. Because I think I don't know, Rachel, if you found the same thing. I think one of the things that I found very difficult was when I was diagnosed, I just didn't know where to look.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you, because I was just thinking that as you were talking about, and I'm just going to bring to mind, Shift MS, just because that is primarily set up as a sort of forum, an interaction. And I think when it was first set up, it was for people who were newly diagnosed, but now it sort of covers the whole spectrum. And I think what Trishna said, there's a lot more information out there, but also I think there's the whole social capital, the social element to MS. As I said, when I was first diagnosed, I couldn't think of anybody that had MS. And I couldn't think of, and I was, again, quite reluctant to go to, say, a formal meeting and walk in the door and introduce myself. Whereas I do think on forums like, like Shift MS, there's a lot more interaction, and you can ask a question, not feel embarrassed or not feel stupid. And it's just getting the feedback. And I think a big thing of it is knowing that you're not alone. And that, to me, I think has been, that's been a huge point, that there are other people out there that are in the same predicament or might have been through something similar. And also, I just think we all feel better, isn't it? That when we think, well, we've reached out to somebody, possibly we've helped them. And then when we're feeling a bit low, because it happens to all of us with MS, there are people there that kind of say, hey, we're with you. So I think, so the combination, there's a lot of great information websites, media channels like this. And also there is the social side, which I think is hugely helpful.
So let's talk a little bit. Oh, go ahead.
So I was going to say that I think also now there is so much more out there which is tailored to sort of particular communities' experiences, because even though we all have MS, our experiences might also be affected or impacted by, for example, your age, your cultural background, whether you're male or female, and things like that. So, I mean, I know that in the US, for instance, there's various groups that, for example, are for African Americans who have MS, or Latin American people of Latin American heritage who have MS. Here in the UK, we also have very, very similar groups that are forming. So MS Together, for instance, is specifically aimed at younger people who have MS, so people in their 20s and 30s. You have Asian MS, which is one of the national support groups that works under the umbrella of the MS Society of the UK, and that's specifically targeted towards people with a South Asian background who have MS. Talks with MS is for the Black community who are affected by MS. So there's these groups that are now providing what I would call more targeted, sort of culturally specific or sensitive support. So it might not be that, I mean, I remember when I went to my first MS Society group meeting, and I walked in and there weren't many Asians there. And I thought, well, there were things which I was going through which were specific to the fact that I was an Asian person who had been diagnosed with MS. So things like trying to explain to extended family members what it was that I'd been diagnosed with in a different language.
Right.
Things around stigma and a lack of awareness of what multiple sclerosis is in the Asian community. In the Asian community now, everybody knows what diabetes is, they know that it's the sugar illness or heart disease, because heart disease and diabetes are very, very prevalent within the South Asian community. MS isn't. And so when I was telling people that I'd been diagnosed with this, they'd never heard of it. They didn't know what it was. So I think being able to address that, again, I mean, Rachel, you hit the nail on the head. You're not alone. And even if there are things which are specific to who you are as a person, we talk about intersectionality, chances are there is a group out there who will be able to provide that support specific to that facet of who you are that is impacting your experience of living with MS.
And that in and of itself has been a shift, right? You know, because those communities didn't exist. You know, I live in Atlanta, which is a suburban, well, I live in the suburbs. Nobody actually lives in the city of Atlanta. Most of us live in the suburbs, and we just say we're in Atlanta. But, you know, my challenge as a provider is that I had many young women with MS who were Black and African American, maybe working, raising their kids, didn't really see themselves in, you know, many of the support groups or support circles. And so the fact that we now have these communities springing up, and of course, everyone can be a part of the general communities, right? But sometimes you need that additional support, you know, as well. And so I'm really excited and applaud the work that you all and many others have been doing to try to create these spaces so that people feel safe and they can get some support, even if they may not need the same support as, you know, someone in a different type of group. So I think that that's extremely important. And I often encourage people to find their tribe, so to speak.
Yeah, well, you've very much been, I was going to say, you've been very much leading the way in the US, haven't you, with your work with the National MS Society? And yeah, it's not, you know, MS is not the traditional, you know, sort of white European disease that we thought it was, and also do some very interesting work with saying MS affects, it looks like it, you know, MS affects different ethnic groups, you know, differently. So that will be very interesting to see what comes out of that.
Absolutely.
And doing that kind of research is so important.
It is.
Because it will not only help us understand better about MS, who might be, you know, who might, for example, be more likely to develop, you know, a more aggressive MS and things like that, but also in terms of how people might react to different medications, how effective they might be, what kind of side effect profile they might have, because we know that depending on, for example, your genetics and things like that, you might react to medications or in a different way in terms of effectiveness, in terms of side effect profiles. And unless this research is being done, we're going to be in that position where actually what is being developed isn't necessarily what we can say is generalizable to the entire patient community, because the entire patient community isn't being represented in clinical research.
Absolutely. I mean, so now you speak in my language. I mean, you know, so you gave a great segue to what I wanted to talk to, which was research, right? So, you know, so research is a passion of mine, you know, to make sure that everyone is included in the research process. Whether they are from different ethnic backgrounds, whether they are from rural places, whether, you know, I think it's very important because ultimately we want whatever we are doing to reflect the people that we're trying to serve. And I think ultimately in medicine, we're trying to develop what we call personalized medicine plans, right? So I look at Trishna and I say, okay, Trishna, based on this, your disease activity, these factors, or Rachel, based on this and this and these factors, we think this is the best plan for you. And it's hard to do that when everybody is not a part of the conversation. And so I'm a really big advocate for that. But I think that likewise, when we talk about inclusiveness in research, we go back to including the patient perspective. And this is something that is relatively new in the scientific process. You know, I was very fortunate to participate in a clinical trial where we had patient advisors in the very beginning stages of creating the protocol. And it was the first time I'd ever experienced that, as well as my colleagues, but it was so eye-opening because there were things that we looked at and said, oh no, nobody's going to go for that. We shouldn't do that. And the patient was like, no. We want to do the best study. We want all the things. And we were like, really? Okay. And so I really love and applaud the fact that you all are so involved in the research process. So tell me a little bit about how you got into the research space and kind of some of the work that you do. I know, Trishna, you're on an editorial board. Rachel, we've done an article together recently that we're working on getting published. So tell us a little bit about how you kind of navigated into that space and the importance of the patient voice and perspective in the actual research process.
Well, for me, I think because the neurologists are, I think because you've seen the shift. So I don't know if you found, Trisha, they kind of reach out to you because they kind of need you.
We do.
I mean, you kind of stick your hand up once and they've got your phone number and they're going to get in touch with you. So right now I'm just involved in one trial with the ATTACK MS trial, which is looking to see whether or not you can get treated from presentation of first symptoms, showing up in an emergency room to A&E, to within 14 days being on a very effective disease-modifying treatment, Tysabri, and just seeing if that's the best way to treat MS. Can that stop further brain damage, damage and disability down the line? So that's been really fascinating because I was, I had to kind of stick up my hand and say, how are you going to, tell somebody who kind of, goes into an A&E and has got sort of dragging their leg or perhaps has tingles in their hands. And you say, oh, by the way, I know you came in with that, but you actually have this, progressive disabling disease called MS, and we want you to start an infusion. Within, how do you break that news? I mean, obviously, Mitzi, you've got training in it, but what do you do to a young physician he's not used to dealing with this? And another thing I was going to just toss in, I think because we've also got the luxury now of having, so many disease modifying therapies, because what are we up to, 2025 now? And I've got quite a bit, I've been now much more involved in pushing for women's health in MS, because we know women are diagnosed with MS, say 2/3 and even more often than men. How so it looks to me, not to me, sorry, to the scientists, that it's obviously something to do with hormones. How is that affecting menstruation, or has it affect with family planning, or when you're pregnant, or breastfeeding, or IVF? And then of course later on when we go through the menopause, which all of us with MS will go through, does that trigger more disease activity? So I think also in this space we've tended to have many more male neurologists, and now we're seeing a shift, and now we're seeing things open up and more of these conversations, which I think and studies, which I think are absolutely fantastic.
Absolutely. It's so interesting because I have some colleagues who are, very much into family planning, and it's been a very apparent shift. Whereas we used to just say, go off your medicine, let's see what happens. Now there are people that, I have 2 girlfriends. Every time we're at a meeting, they're talking about breast milk. Like, did you get those samples? And I'm like, okay, maybe I don't want to drink my milk right now. But, but again, I think that there's been a shift to that recognition that there are things that affect people's everyday life. And yes, we want to find a cure for MS. Yes, we want to find the cause, the biologic underpinnings and all of that. But ultimately, we need to shift some of that focus to seeing how can we really help people on a regular basis. And I think this has really been, a lot of the push and advocacy from the patient community to help us understand that we need to focus on what's going to help someone on a day-to-day basis. There are a lot more studies about diet and exercise. People have been asking me about that since I started practicing. And, in the beginning, I have very, very vague answers. My answers are still a little vague, but I've got more information now. Because you all have really done a great job in raising awareness and bringing attention to, hey, I have to live with this condition. Like, tell me how to live with this, and let's also do the science, but show us how, we can, make our everyday lives better. And Trishna, tell us how you got on that editorial board. How did that happen?
I didn't, and like many things that happen in my life, I was asked because somebody somewhere had seen something that I'd done. So I've been very involved in trying to get the patient voice heard within scientific publications.
Mm.
I think it's an area of medicine, of the medicine's development life cycle of healthcare that has been very much forgotten about. So we've seen a shift in terms of what we call patient centricity, patient centeredness, where I would say we've become much better within the middle of the medicine's development life cycle. So, getting patient insights into disease awareness campaigns, into more protocol design, into, in that sort of middle section. Where we're still lacking, I think, is the setting of research priorities, although that is changing. And we are seeing, as Rachel said, even things like around, for example, the MS and menopause, we're seeing some of these research setting priorities being pushed by patients themselves, but also right at at the very end of that medicine's development life cycle, which is the scientific publications. And having the patient voice involved in that is really important, because we've had a move towards open science, open access, which has been brilliant. And for patients, it's been great because it has allowed them to see information which traditionally had been behind a paywall and was only available to healthcare professionals. But now that we are getting access to this information, we need to also ensure that patients are able to understand it. Right. They understand the relevance, they can read it. And so I've been very vocal about things like plain language summaries, about having patient reviewers of peer-reviewed publications. There are some journals that have been doing this for quite some time. So the BMJ, for instance, has had patient peer reviewers. But also in having patients in areas where traditionally you wouldn't have necessarily seen them. So, for example, on editorial boards, to be able to push the type of research that is being published, make sure that, it's relevant for patients, that patients have a voice. And I'm also really, really passionate about patient authorship. More patients can be authors on scientific publications. They can publish their own research. They can be a part of an authorship group if they've been involved in the design of research. And as we get more and more patients involved in the design of studies and the design of protocols, that qualifies them for authorship. So let's not forget that right at the end, when you have, the studies being published, patients can be part of that authorship group and can help to guide the way that the publication is being written, push for a plain language summary, push for the fact that it should be in an open access journal. And then also disseminate. There's actually research to show that, certain publications where there has been patients involved, dissemination has been much wider. There's research to show that publications that have plain language summaries attached actually increases the readership of the original manuscript. So things like this show that patients can have an influence. So that was quite a long-winded answer to the fact that how did you get onto the editorial board?
Excellent.
It's because I'm involved in this space, and I'm passionate. And, more patients should be involved in it, because it's just another area of healthcare medicine where our voice needs to be heard.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about how you got into doing publications and things like that, Rachel. So how did you go from, I don't know what kind of journalism work you were doing before, but now I see you everywhere and you got your award now. And so tell us how you got into that, how you became more passionate about publishing in the, peer-reviewed journals.
Sure. Well, I always wanted to be a journalist, and so I did. After university, I ended up going to China for a couple of years because I just, this is pre-internet, and so you thought, well, I've got to go where the story is, and so that was the start. And then I went to my master's in journalism, and for many years, I worked covering international news and business news. And then after my kids, I started to get a little bit more in the MS side. And I remember, I think I was slightly useful because I do have a journalism background. So I was invited to
very useful, not slightly useful, extremely
yes,
helpful.
And some neurologists, I think they just tend to write like they're, scientific, or they're used to speaking to colleagues and shorthand and acronyms. And I'm thinking, hang on, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. How can we make this so it's a bit more presentable? I'm not saying overload it with adjectives or adverbs, but so that's why. And I think they wanted to have a patient voice involved. And I was able to point out and say, oh, hold on, I think you've missed that. And just maybe make it a bit clearer and cleaner. So it's been, it's very different, I think, working with on an article, because I think when you, as a journalist, you tend to sort of work alone, and you might have, an interaction with your editor. But when you're working on, scientific, there's so many co-authors, and in a way, I quite like it, because somebody writes something and then everybody checks it and agrees on it. It's very much of a team effort, and so that was really, I really am enjoying doing that.
It's like a living document. I mean, if I see one more Google Doc with edits and comments on the side, and then I have to make sure I look at the last one to make sure I don't make the same comment someone else said, or I might just say ditto or agree. But it really is cool to see that collaboration, but I totally agree that it's so important to have the patient voice throughout the process. And if you think about the way we write scientific articles, it's very different from how they were written, even centuries ago. They were very descriptive. They were like stories. It'd be like somebody walked in the office and they had a leg that was weak. I mean, it used to be like creative writing, and now we've just made it so sterile that it's hard to understand.
I guess it's also patient confidentiality, which I think, so it's kind of, as you said, it is very sterile.
Yeah. So we got to give it some life. We got to make it more interesting for people to read. I mean, hey, those plain language summaries help me just as much as the next person, if it's not an area that I have expertise in, right? So, I'm not an endocrinologist. So, that plain language summary could really help me understand something. So, our time is coming to a close. As much as I hate to say it, this has been an amazing, amazing conversation. I always love talking with you ladies. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing in the space. Just give us any last minute advice you have for those out there who are, just getting into this MS journey and kind of figuring out how to advocate for themselves, and also tell us where to find you.
Go ahead, Trishna.
So, I'm on social media. I'm very easy to find. Apparently, there is only one Trishna Baradia in the world.
One of a kind.
Apparently. I'm on Instagram, Twitter. I'm on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn. If you just type in Trishna Baradia, you will find me. I would say
Dancing with Mom and Sister. Please tell Mom I said hi.
And I think my one piece of advice would be, if you want to advocate for yourself, if you want to get into advocacy, just that itself, there is lots of support out there. So there are advocacy groups on Facebook, advocacy. So when I say advocacy groups, so groups that are for patient advocates, where you can learn, you can share, have a look and see what other advocates are doing. We're a community, and we help each other. So if you've got questions, ask. I'm often asked by people, say, look, I want to get into advocacy. How did you do it? What are your tips? There's also obviously the various MS organizations, and they can provide support for getting into advocacy. But also wider, there's other groups. So the Social Health Network, for instance, which used to be called We Go Health, that's for patient advocates from all different condition areas. And everybody supports each other. There's some training and resources which are freely available on their website. There's, if you want to get into patient authorship, there is a fantastic online free training course on patient authorship. So if you put in "We Can" patient authorship training into Google, it should come up. But there's all this stuff available. It's out there. Most of it is online and free. And it's just a question of, I think, taking that first step and knowing that you're not doing it alone, because there's other Trishnas, there's other Rachels out there who are there to support and help.
I love it.
Yeah.
Rachel?
I'm on, Twitter or X or whatever you want to call
I was about to say, now it's X.
Oh, I said Twitter, didn't I? It's X now.
Anyhow, I'm Rachel Horn 19, so there's more than, there's a lot of us out there. Rachel, and I'm just, that's as much as that's it. I think, just like Trisha said, get involved, show up. And I think it's a hugely welcoming community. And everybody's views are welcome. Everybody showing up is welcome. You can do as little as you want or as much as you want. And I think once you get in there, I think it's one of the best things I've done with MS. As I said, MS, nobody wants to have it. But I've met some absolutely fantastic people, and some in both the scientific MS scientific community like yourself, Dr. Mitzi, and also people with MS, which I never would have had the chance to meet before.
Awesome. Tell us a little bit about your research prize.
Oh gosh, yeah. Very quickly, we actually do have a winner, but I'm not allowed to tell you because it hasn't been. Yes, so there was 10. It's a Rachel Horn MS prize for women's research, because what I noticed was a lot of the women neurologists and neuroscientists were not tended to be overlooked when it came to receiving prizes, major medical MS prizes, and also that women neurologists and researchers, they were the ones that were tending to focus on issues that were women based or women linked, as I said, to pregnancy, menopause. So I decided to set up a prize to kind of honor both. So it's open. It's a $40,000 US prize. It will be presented to at ECTRIMS, which is the largest annual MS prize in Milan in October. And it's being awarded to a woman neurologist, neuroscience, who's made an outstanding contribution to women's research in MS. So the feeling is, when she wins, women with MS win. Yeah. So
Awesome.
Really pleased. Yeah.
Well, listen, you ladies are amazing. I could talk to you all day, but we do have to go.
Yep.
So thank you so much for your efforts, for all the amazing work that you were doing. And thank you to everyone for watching Brain Chat tonight. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.